Greetings. Today we delve into a hidden chapter of World War II, an encounter that challenges everything you thought you knew about warfare on Okinawa. Imagine a quiet dawn on April 16th, 1945, shattered by an unprecedented weapon that looks more like a flying telephone pole than a missile. What was that colossal cylindrical object seen beneath a Corsair's wing? Could a tiny rocket with a diameter of less than a foot really cause the kind of destruction that made entire bunkers implode? And how did American scientists manage to transform a single-engine fighter into a flying artillery platform capable of delivering such devastating blows? But that's not all. Just months before, Japanese commanders dismissed reports of these enormous rockets as propaganda, convinced that launching such weapons from fighters was impossible. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, a brilliant strategist warned that America was secretly developing advanced rocket technology, warnings that had been ignored. Was Japan's entire defensive strategy about to be rendered obsolete by a weapon they refused to believe existed? All these pieces form a baffling puzzle. What is the true story behind the Tiny Tim missile? How did a weapon so small in size wield such overwhelming destructive power? And what does this reveal about the hidden technological race during the final year of the war? In this video, we will uncover the secrets behind this extraordinary weapon, separating fact from fiction, and revealing a shocking new perspective on how the war in Okinawa was transformed forever. The most astonishing truths are about to come to light, so stay with us as we begin this incredible journey into the depths of wartime innovation and deception. The story starts now. On the dawn of April the 16th, in the year 1945, the island of Okinawa was shrouded in the early morning light, with the sun casting its first golden rays over the tumultuous waters of Naha Harbor. At precisely 6 o'clock in the morning, Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Manabe, a seasoned officer of the Imperial Japanese Navy, took his place atop a carefully camouflaged observation post, strategically positioned to oversee the harbor's vast expanse. Through his binoculars, he focused intently on the approaching fleet of American aircraft, particularly on a squadron of Vought F-4U Corsairs making their way from the northeast. These aircraft, famous for their distinctive inverted gull wings, gleamed faintly in the rising sunlight, their silhouettes sharp against the clear sky. It was in this tranquil yet tense moment that Manabe's sharp eyes detected something unusual beneath the aircraft wings. A sight that would soon alter the understanding of warfare on this island forever. What he observed appeared to be colossal cylindrical objects, far surpassing in size any typical rocket or missile he had encountered before. These were no ordinary ordnance. They were massive, almost comically disproportionate structures, resembling flying telephone poles rather than conventional military equipment. Before he could fully grasp what he was witnessing, the lead Corsair suddenly released one of these enormous projectiles. The rocket detached from the aircraft, briefly dropping in altitude and then erupted into a brilliant and searing flame at its tail, propelling it forward at an incredible speed of over 500 miles per hour. The missile's trajectory was swift and relentless, heading directly toward one of the heavily fortified Japanese coastal defenses that had endured weeks of relentless naval bombardment. When the missile struck its target, a reinforced concrete bunker designed to withstand the most ferocious assaults, the explosion was unlike anything Manabe had ever seen in his military career. The entire structure did not simply blow apart into loose debris, but seemed to implode from within, as if the very core of the bunker had been dissolved. Massive chunks of concrete, some as large as automobiles, were flung hundreds of feet into the air in all directions. The force of the blast wave was so powerful that it knocked Manabe backward despite his position nearly 800 meters away from the epicenter. The ground shook violently beneath him, and a deafening roar filled the air, emphasizing the destructive magnitude of what he had just witnessed. It was only later, when captured American documents came into Japanese hands, that Manabe would learn the true nature of the weapon that had devastated his defenses. This eerie and formidable missile was named the Tiny Tim, an ironically diminutive name for something so overwhelmingly destructive. The Tiny Tim was a rocket with a diameter of nearly 12 inches, weighing over 2,000 pounds, and equipped with a warhead containing approximately 148 pounds of TNT. Essentially, it resembled a flying torpedo capable of being launched from a single-engine fighter aircraft, transforming each Corsair or Hellcat into a potent mobile artillery platform. The implications of this weapon were almost unfathomable. It represented a hybrid of traditional naval firepower and air-delivered precision. The revelation of the tiny Tim sent shockwaves through the upper echelons of the Imperial Japanese Navy, fundamentally challenging their previous assumptions about American military capabilities. For months, their military strategists had prepared for conventional aerial bombing raids, and later for the increasingly common kamikaze attacks launched by their own forces. However, they had not foreseen that the Americans would develop and deploy such a hybrid weapon, one that combined the destructive force of a battleship shell with the agility and accuracy of a fighter bomber. This weapon had the potential to transform every Corsair and Hellcat into a flying artillery battery, capable of delivering devastating blows against some of the most fortified and hardened targets on the island, with remarkable precision and destructive power. Turning back in time to 3 months earlier, in the month of January of the same year, the leadership of the Japanese military had been skeptical of the reports coming from their intelligence sources regarding the development of American rockets. Vice Admiral Matagaki, stationed at his command headquarters in Koya Air Base in southern Kyushu, had dismissed the photographs and intelligence briefs showing American fighters carrying what appeared to be oversized rockets as either propaganda efforts or experimental weapons that would never see practical combat. He had confidently told his staff officers that these reports were exaggerations, attempts by the Americans to intimidate Japan through theatrical displays of impractical weaponry. He believed that the Americans' so-called giant rockets were nothing more than propaganda bluff. The Japanese engineers had thoroughly calculated that launching such enormous rockets from single-engine fighters was impossible without destroying the aircraft in the process. This dilemma was not unique to Japan, as the Germans had faced similar hurdles with their own large-caliber rocket experiments. Admittedly, Admiral Matagaki felt confident that Japan's defensive positions, including their extensive network of fortified bunkers and coastal defenses, were sufficiently robust to withstand any new American threats. Throughout the final years of the war, Japan had invested heavily in constructing formidable concrete fortifications across Okinawa and the surrounding home islands. These massive defenses were designed to withstand virtually any aerial assault, with the exception of the most intense naval bombardments masterminded by the Allies. Their formidable nature was such that, even under relentless attack, they could potentially hold out against most conventional forms of aerial bombardment. The Japanese military leadership believed that these extensive fortifications alone would be sufficient to repel invading forces and frustrate any Allied attempts to gain ground. At the same time, there was a brilliant tactical mind working behind the scenes, Captain Minor Genda. Known for his exceptional strategic insight, Genda had played a pivotal role in orchestrating the attack on Pearl Harbor, showcasing his deep understanding of aerial combat and offensive planning. As early as December of the year 1944, Genda issued a warning that would prove remarkably prescient. His assessment highlighted the possibility of American development in advanced rocket technology, specifically pointing out intelligence gathered from the Philippines campaign, which indicated that the United States Navy was actively working on increasingly powerful air-to-ground rockets. Despite the seriousness of his concerns, his warnings were largely disregarded by senior Japanese commanders who remained convinced that Japan's layered defensive system, a synergistic combination of kamikaze attacks, conventional airstrikes, and heavily fortified positions, would be sufficient to prevent any new American weapon from tipping the scales significantly. Furthermore, Genda's specific fears regarding the testing of super heavy rockets at American naval air stations were dismissed outright. Many within the Japanese command believed that such developments were improbable, primarily because launching enormous rockets from carrier-based aircraft posed immense technical challenges they thought impossible to overcome. Nevertheless, American scientists at the California Institute of Technology had been making remarkable progress since 1944. They developed an innovative drop-launch system for the Tiny Tim rocket that effectively circumvented these challenges by allowing the rocket to detach from the aircraft before ignition. This breakthrough meant that the rocket would fall away from the plane safely, connected only by a lanyard that would trigger the firing of the rocket motor once it had achieved sufficient separation from the aircraft. This design was revolutionary and addressed many of the stability and safety concerns that typically plagued large rockets. Unfortunately for Japan, their intelligence apparatus was unaware of this technological advancement, maintaining the misconception that American rocket capabilities were constrained by fundamental laws of physics and engineering, just as their own were. This misjudgment proved to be extremely costly as the war drew to a close, exposing a critical flaw in their strategic assumptions. The development of the Tiny Tim symbolized more than just an increment in missile technology. It represented a profound shift in the tactical landscape of aerial warfare. With this weapon, single-engine fighters gained the capacity to deliver devastating strikes that previously had been the domain of heavy bombers or naval artillery. Commander Masafumi Arma had been among the earliest military thinkers to envisage the importance of this technological evolution. Before his death in October of 1944, during one of the initial organized kamikaze assaults, Arma authored a technical paper exploring the potential of large-caliber aerial rockets. In his work, he argued that if such weapons could be successfully developed and deployed, they would fundamentally alter naval warfare. Specifically, he believed aircraft would be able to strike warships from beyond the range of their anti-aircraft defenses, effectively transforming fighters into long-range artillery platforms capable of crippling enemy ships before they could retaliate. However, the Japanese Naval General Staff dismissed Arma's visionary ideas as excessively futuristic. They pointed out that even Germany's advanced rocket program, which was the most sophisticated in Europe at the time, had yet to produce anything remotely comparable in size or destructive power to what Arma envisioned. The consensus among Japanese military engineers was that the technical hurdles, particularly issues with stability, accuracy, and reliable guidance, posed insurmountable obstacles for large rockets, relegating them to the realm of impracticality. They believed such weapons could only function effectively for area bombardments, rather than precise strikes against maneuvering naval targets. Japan's exposure to American rocket technology had been a gradual process, beginning with the deployment of small, forward-firing aircraft rockets in 1944, projectiles measuring approximately 35 inches in length. These initial weapons marked the beginning of a new phase in aerial warfare, offering the Japanese Navy a glimpse of the potential future of missile technology. Although these early rockets were relatively modest in scale, they laid the groundwork for more ambitious projects that would follow, even as the Japanese military remained skeptical of the feasibility of large-caliber rockets capable of dramatic, long-range destruction. Still, the ongoing development and testing of American rocket systems signaled a significant technological challenge, one that ultimately proved decisive in the final months of the conflict and underscored the importance of innovation and rapid technological adaptation in modern warfare. The developments in American military technology during the final stages of World War II presented a series of incremental advances that, while concerning, did not fundamentally alter Japan's strategic calculations. Initially, the introduction of high-velocity aircraft rockets, what the Americans referred to colloquially as Holy Moses, caused some alarm, yet they still fell within the scope of what Japanese military planners had anticipated. These 5-inch rockets proved more troublesome than previous munitions by their ability to penetrate light armor and inflict devastating damage on aircraft on the ground. But their capabilities did not represent a revolutionary leap in American offensive power. The arrival of these rocket systems marked an increase in firepower for the Allies, yet they did not significantly shift the tactical balance or force Japan to reconsider its defensive strategies substantially. As intelligence on American developments continued to trickle in, reports of an even more formidable weapon, known as Tiny Tim, began to emerge. Many Japanese officers viewed this intelligence with skepticism, assuming it was merely another incremental upgrade, perhaps a missile or rocket in the 6 or 7-inch diameter range, without grasping the magnitude of the technological leap involved. Few could have anticipated that the Americans had advanced to producing an 11 3/4-inch rocket, a size that vastly exceeded conventional expectations and represented a dramatic escalation in firepower. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, Japan's renowned flying ace, who had survived severe injuries sustained earlier in the war, was stationed at Yokosuka Naval Base in February of 1945 when he attended a briefing focused on American weapons research. He later recalled the dismissive attitude among senior officers during this presentation, especially when the intelligence officer mentioned tests of gigantic rockets by the Americans. Officers commonly responded with laughter, with one admiral joking that perhaps the Americans planned to attach wings to their 16-inch shells, a humorous but telling indication of their disbelief or underestimation. Despite Sakai's deep respect for American industrial capacity and technological ingenuity, he found it hard to believe that rockets larger than the German Nebelwerfer artillery, originally designed for ground bombardment, could be practically launched from fighter aircraft. The sheer weight of such weapons, coupled with the recoil they would generate, seemed insurmountable obstacles. Additionally, the risk posed to the launching aircraft from the backblast of these monstrous rockets appeared to render their deployment impractical from a tactical standpoint. However, the reality of American industrial prowess proved to be far more formidable than Japanese estimates. The tiny TIM rocket program benefited from an array of resources that appeared almost fantastical from the Japanese perspective, including repurposed oil well casing pipes. These pipes, which were already being mass-produced for the petroleum industry, allowed the Americans to manufacture the rocket bodies without diverting critical military production lines or causing significant strain on their war manufacturing capacity. The warheads used on these rockets were adapted from existing 500-pound semi-armor piercing bombs, reconfigured for the new purpose. The rocket motors incorporated 4 modified charges taken from the Holy Moses program, components that had already been tested and proven effective. This method of utilizing existing, proven components in new combinations exemplified a practical and resourceful approach, bypassing many development hurdles that traditionally would have taken years to overcome if starting from scratch. This approach was distinctly American in its emphasis on practical results over engineering elegance, prioritizing functionality and rapid deployment rather than refined design. It exemplified a pragmatic innovation born out of the urgent needs of wartime production. Meanwhile, at the Kurai Naval Base, located along the coast where the remnants of the once mighty Imperial Japanese Navy's fleet lay anchored, Rear Admiral Keisuke Kimura commanded the light cruiser Ioto, the flagship of the combined fleet. As he reviewed the defensive arrangements, a growing sense of unease weighed on him. He was fully aware that American carrier strikes were inevitable. The extensive air and naval superiority of the Allies had become undeniable. Still, Kimura believed that the concentrated anti-aircraft defenses mounted around Kurai, combined with the natural protective features of the surrounding hills and the unwavering courage of kamikaze pilots willing to sacrifice themselves, might still impose enough resistance to prevent any decisive attack from the enemy. Despite these convictions, he understood that the Japanese defenses would face tremendous pressure, and perhaps, in the end, would not be enough to turn back the relentless tide of American military might. Threat unlike anything they had previously encountered, an invisible, precise, and overwhelmingly destructive force that could sink ships with terrifying ease. No longer could their ships rely solely on traditional anti-aircraft defenses or evasive maneuvers to escape attack. The new weapons could strike from a distance with devastating accuracy, rendering old tactics obsolete. This sudden shift in the nature of naval warfare was both a shock and a stark reminder of the technological gap widening between the Allies and Japan. Throughout the Pacific Campaign, the Japanese military had encountered various forms of American ordnance, but nothing prepared them for the emergence of these tiny but immensely powerful rockets, which the Americans called Tiny Tims. Pooh. Their first confirmed use in combat came during the preliminary bombing raids aimed at preparing for the upcoming invasion of Okinawa. However, initial reports from the Japanese side were met with skepticism. Some commanders dismissed the accounts as exaggerated tales born from panic, while others refused to believe the reports outright. An especially extraordinary claim came from a coastal defense unit that stated an American fighter had destroyed a reinforced concrete ammunition bunker using just a single rocket, an assertion that seemed physically impossible, given what Japanese engineers understood about rocket warhead capacities and the limitations of their armor-piercing capabilities. Despite these initial doubts, reports from multiple Japanese units began to describe similar incidents involving rockets of unprecedented size, which appeared to dig into their targets before exploding with catastrophic force. These descriptions painted a picture of weapons so advanced that they could penetrate heavy armor and hardened structures that had previously been considered virtually immune to attack, especially from aircraft. As the reports accumulated, senior Japanese military leaders started to realize that they were dealing with an entirely new category of weapon, one that fundamentally challenged their existing defensive strategies and assumptions. One of the most telling accounts came from Captain Toshiharu Inaguchi, a senior staff officer responsible for kamikaze operations. On April 18, 1945, he recorded in his diary that the appearance of what he and his pilots had begun calling monster rockets represented a significant psychological blow, almost as damaging as the physical destruction they caused. The rocket's appearance signaled that, even as Japan resorted to the desperate measure of turning its pilots into human-guided missiles for suicide attacks, the Americans had developed a new class of weapon with comparable, if not greater, destructive potential, capable of being used repeatedly by the same aircraft and pilot. This realization underscored the alarming technological disparity growing between the two nations, and fueled fears that Japan's military morale would take a further hit as the true extent of American industrial and technological superiority became clear. A stark and gruesome demonstration of the Tiny Tim's lethal capability occurred on April 22, 1945, during an attack on the Japanese destroyer escort Amati near Okinawa. Two Marine Corsairs from Marine Fighter Squadron 312, engaging the ship from well beyond the reach of its anti-aircraft guns, launched their rockets with precision. Among these was Commander Misao Yamashita, who had initially been confident that his vessel's maneuverability and defenses would protect it. Yet he watched in horror as the bright, swift projectiles streaked toward his ship, one passing just meters from the stern, missing by a narrow margin, but the other striking a midship section with devastating impact. The rocket's warhead punched straight through the hull and detonated inside the vessel's midsection with tremendous force. The explosion was so intense that it lifted the entire midship area of the destroyer from its keel, causing catastrophic structural failure, and within seconds, the ship was doomed. The explosion tore the ship apart, sinking her swiftly and claiming the lives of 93 sailors in the process. The psychological impact of this attack was immediate and profound among Japanese naval personnel. For the first time, they faced a weapon so precise, powerful, and capable of causing such destruction from a distance that traditional defenses seemed almost futile. It highlighted the terrifying reality that they were no longer battling enemies with conventional aircraft and bombs, but with advanced missile-like projectiles that could strike with deadly certainty from afar. This new threat not only represented a leap in technology, but also profoundly affected the morale and strategic mindset of the Japanese forces. It shattered any remaining illusions that their ships and defenses could withstand the relentless technological advances brought forth by the American military effort. The Tiny Tims exemplified the brutal evolution of aerial warfare, making clear that the Pacific conflict was entering a new, more deadly phase, where innovation and precision would determine survival in the increasingly perilous theater of combat. The advent of this new weapon dramatically undermined many of the traditional defensive strengths that had previously offered Japanese vessels some measure of protection. These were rockets capable of being launched from distances beyond the reach of anti-aircraft defenses, yet with a level of accuracy comparable to that of dive bombers, an achievement that was particularly terrifying considering the circumstances. Unlike torpedoes, which could sometimes be evaded through skilled maneuvering, or whose destructive potential could be moderated by effective damage control techniques, these rockets struck with an almost unstoppable precision, reminiscent of naval gunfire in their speed and lethality. Their warheads were designed to penetrate thick armor and internal compartments before detonation, unleashing catastrophic destruction that was exceedingly difficult to contain or repair. A first-hand account from Petty Officer Yoshio Nakamura, a survivor of the sinking of the Amatsaki, provides a chilling insight into the suddenness and ferocity of such attacks. During interrogations by American forces, Nakamura described how the first warning sign of the attack was the sight of the rockets themselves, which appeared in the sky like fiery flying telephone poles, engulfed in flames as they streaked toward their targets. By the time the anti-aircraft artillery personnel managed to swivel their guns to track these incoming projectiles, the rockets had already been launched and were on their destructive course, reaching their targets within a matter of seconds, less than 30 from the first visual detection to impact. Nakamura vividly expressed the helplessness felt by the crew members who had been trained to defend against traditional aerial assaults involving enemy aircraft. They had been caught completely unprepared for a weapon system that combined the long-range reach of naval gunfire with the pinpoint accuracy historically associated with dive bombers, an ability that, only a few months earlier, would have been considered a minor threat by Japan's Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. The emergence of these rockets sparked intense debate among military leaders. Some officers in the army dismissed the threat, arguing that such weapons were likely limited in number, experimental in nature, and prone to unreliability in combat situations. They believed these systems might not prove to be a decisive factor in naval engagements. Meanwhile, Navy officials and commanders who had witnessed the destruction of their ships took a far more serious view. They argued that these rockets, which had come to be called Tiny Tim, signaled a fundamental shift in the strategic balance of power at sea. The tactical advantage provided by this technology meant that American aircraft could operate as flying artillery, delivering devastating payloads with unprecedented accuracy from safe distances. Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi, notably the father of Japan's kamikaze program, reportedly remarked that these rockets demonstrated that the United States had effectively solved the problem Japan had been trying to address through desperate suicide attacks, namely, the challenge of delivering large, powerful explosive payloads with precision against heavily fortified targets. However, the key difference was that the Americans had achieved this without human sacrifice, relying instead on advanced technology. The industrial capacity invested in producing these miniature missiles was staggering to Japanese planners, who could scarcely comprehend the scale of resources dedicated to their manufacture. Japan at the time struggled to produce sufficient conventional ammunition to equip its remaining forces and had to allocate whatever resources it could gather to each kamikaze mission. In stark contrast, the Americans had developed a manufacturing process capable of producing these massive rockets on a large scale by repurposing surplus industrial materials. The raw materials used for the rockets' bodies, such as the oil well casings that form their main structure, were produced at a rate that would have consumed Japan's entire steel allotment for aircraft manufacturing. For the American war effort, this was merely a matter of redirecting surplus industrial capacity, utilizing existing resources more efficiently. Each Tiny Tim rocket carried more explosive power than most Japanese fighter bombers could deliver in conventional bombing runs. This new weapon effectively transformed the battlefield, introducing a level of destructive power and precision previously unseen in naval warfare, and forcing the Japanese military to confront an emerging threat that was both technologically advanced and devastating in its destructive potential. The Tiny Tims, capable of being mounted in pairs on each aircraft, represented a revolutionary leap in missile technology during the closing chapters of World War II. Lieutenant Commander Maset Kumiya, who was stationed at Kanoya Air Base, personally witnessed a demonstration of these formidable rockets during a daring raid on May 13, 1945. On that day, Marine Corsair fighters launched a series of attacks targeting heavily fortified Japanese airfields and their reinforced hangars, structures deliberately designed to withstand the destructive force of conventional bombing campaigns. Remarkably, these hangars had survived numerous raids by the massive B-29 bombers with only minimal damage, underscoring their resilience. However, when the Tiny Tims were employed, they demonstrated a destructive capability that seemed almost supernatural in comparison. These small but powerful rockets performed as bunker busters, effortlessly penetrating the thick concrete roofs of the reinforced hangars before detonating inside. In one dramatic instance, a single rocket struck a hangar housing 6 invaluable Zero fighters. The explosion was so intense that the entire structure was obliterated. The fighters inside were reduced to a smoking crater, leaving nothing but debris behind. In another striking example, a rocket hit the runway itself, creating a gaping hole that took Japanese engineers 3 days to repair. An impressive feat considering that repairing such damage with traditional bombing methods would have required dozens of conventional bombs. The destructive efficiency of this missile was clear. It could cause damage of a scale typically associated with larger, more powerful explosive devices, but with far less weight and effort. The Japanese Navy's efforts to counter the tiny TIMs proved largely ineffective, owing to several key factors. These rockets could be launched from ranges that made it virtually impossible for anti-aircraft guns to target them effectively. Once launched, their high speed of over 500 miles per hour rendered visual tracking nearly impossible. This combination of range, speed, and precision meant that defending ships or ground targets against these rockets was a daunting, if not impossible, task. Furthermore, the psychological impact on Japanese anti-aircraft crews was profound. As these massive rockets streaked toward their targets, crews often experienced panic, which further diminished their ability to respond effectively. The sight of these missiles rushing through the sky in high-speed assaults left many defending personnel overwhelmed and unable to mount an adequate defense. Japanese officers observed that their troops began to colloquially refer to the rockets as flying torpedoes or aerial long lances, likening them to Japan's own feared Type 93 torpedo. They recognized that while Japan had achieved a significant level of surface warfare proficiency, with such torpedoes, the Americans had effectively translated that prowess into the air by harnessing the power of these rockets. It was a stark reminder that Air Force technological advancement had surpassed traditional naval surface weapons, giving the Americans a devastating advantage in their strategic arsenal. On Okinawa, Colonel Hirami Yahara, the senior staff officer of the Japanese 32nd Army, recorded in his operational diary that the tiny TIMs had rendered many of their meticulously prepared defensive positions all but useless. In particular, the coastal defense guns, integral to preventing American naval forces from closing in too closely, became vulnerable. These guns were embedded within caves and reinforced with concrete, designed to withstand everything short of direct hits from battleship main guns. Yet the rockets could be delivered with surgical accuracy by fighter bombers operating from escort carriers, effectively turning each American carrier into a makeshift heavy cruiser in terms of shore bombardment capacity. One illustrative example of their destructive power was demonstrated during the attack on Japanese shipping in Naha Harbor on the 28th of April, 1945. Marine Corsair fighters from VMF-3-12 and VMF-3-23 launched rockets against several transport vessels attempting to unload supplies under the cover of darkness. The rockets proved devastatingly effective, especially against the lightly armored merchant ships. Captain Ichiro Tanaka, commanding the transport Nisho Maru, vividly described how a single rocket tore through his vessel from bow to stern, with the explosion detonating in the engine room. The force of the blast was so immense that it shattered the ship in half, causing it to sink in less than 4 minutes. The sinking of the Nisho Maru was a significant loss, as it was carrying urgently needed ammunition and food supplies intended for the defenders of Okinawa. The technological disparity embodied by the tiny TIMs was a testament to how innovation could dramatically shift the tide of warfare. Their versatility, destructive power, and precision had redefined the possibilities for air-launched missile strikes, revealing that even smaller, seemingly less formidable weapons could have a profound impact when backed by advanced technology. As the war progressed, it became clear that the tiny TIM rockets had established a new standard for aerial attack capabilities, demonstrating that in modern warfare, sophistication and precision often outweigh sheer size and brute force. The development and deployment of these advanced weapon systems drew the attention of seasoned Japanese naval engineers who recognized the extraordinary level of technological sophistication necessary to bring such projectiles into existence. From the meticulous engineering required to produce rocket casings capable of withstanding the enormous pressures and intense temperatures generated during launch, to the complex chemistry of the propellants that provided enough thrust without compromising the integrity of the rockets themselves, every aspect demanded innovative solutions. The aerodynamic design also played a crucial role, ensuring that these massive weapons maintained stability during flight despite their considerable size and weight, a feat that challenged conventional engineering principles. Perhaps most remarkable was the invention of an innovative launch system that allowed these formidable rockets to be launched from single-engine fighter aircraft, an approach so elegant that Japanese engineers admitted they had never envisioned such a possibility. In response to the mounting threat posed by these weapons, Rear Admiral Minoru Mieta, who served as the chief of the Naval Aeronautical Department, summoned an urgent conference on the 2nd of May in the year of 1945. The purpose was to evaluate potential countermeasures against the deadly Tiny Tim projectiles. The assembled team of engineers, tacticians, and strategists quickly realized that their options were severely limited. Their best recommendations centered around dispersing assets and implementing camouflage measures, as the nation's industrial capacity was insufficient to produce counterweapons comparable in potency, and time was too short to develop new offensive or defensive technologies. Furthermore, the existing anti-aircraft defenses, already overwhelmed by conventional aerial attacks, were simply not designed to engage weapons launched from well beyond their current operational range. In his detailed report to the Naval High Command, Mieta concluded that the Tiny Tim represented a fundamental shift in American naval warfare capabilities, not merely a variation of existing threats, but a new kind altogether. It was a difference of kind, not just degree, signaling that the technological gap between the United States and Japan had widened in a way that was increasingly difficult to bridge. The most striking demonstration of the Tiny Tim's destructive potential occurred during the raids on the Kurai Naval Base in July of 1945, a critical juncture when the remnants of the Imperial Japanese Navy lay largely inert, immobilized by fuel shortages. Despite their compromised state, the vessels still retained significant firepower, especially within their anti-aircraft batteries. Rear Admiral Mikoa, commanding the battleship Nagato, a flagship of considerable importance, had arranged to anchor his ship deep within a protected cove at Yokosuka, surrounded by a formidable array of anti-aircraft guns, convinced that any attack would have to navigate a deadly gauntlet of defensive firepower. However, on the 18th of July, the American forces launched a series of strikes that revealed the terrifying new reality of modern warfare. The arrival of the Tiny Tim rockets changed everything. According to some reports, a single rocket, possibly a dud, managed to punch straight through Nagato's hull, piercing the battleship's formidable armor with devastating effect. The psychological impact on the crew was profound. They realized with alarming clarity that even their most powerful ship could be vulnerable to a weapon carried and launched by a solitary fighter aircraft. This realization shattered their previous sense of invincibility. The American attack pattern was meticulously designed to maximize psychological and physical damage. The American fighters, primarily Corsairs and Hellcats, would approach from high altitudes beyond the reach of most anti-aircraft guns, then execute a brief dive to release their rockets before swiftly pulling away to safety. This tactic prevented Japanese gunners from targeting the attacking aircraft, as they never entered the designated kill zone, rendering their defenses largely ineffective. Once launched, the rockets themselves became virtually unstoppable. Fueled by solid propellants that burned intensely for only a few seconds, they achieved velocities that left little room for evasion, accelerating to speeds where interception was impossible. Their semi-armored, semi-armor-piercing warheads were capable of penetrating even the heavily armored decks of heavy cruisers before detonating, causing catastrophic internal damage that could disable or sink even the most formidable ships. On the day of the attack, Lieutenant Kazuoda, serving as an anti-aircraft officer aboard the cruiser Ioto, witnessed firsthand the destructive power of these rockets. His experience underscored the peril posed by the Tiny Tim, as it challenged the very foundations of Japan's naval defenses. The effectiveness of these weapons devastated morale and forced a re-evaluation of existing tactics and defensive strategies, signaling a new era where the individual fighter aircraft, equipped with such potent weaponry, could threaten entire fleets with unprecedented ease. The intense and detailed accounts of the Kurai raids vividly illustrate the overwhelming challenges faced by Japanese defenses in confronting the relentless onslaught of American tactics during the final stages of World War II. Among these tactics, the use of Tiny Tim rockets stood out as a particularly formidable threat, exposing the glaring technical and strategic gaps in Japan's defensive capabilities. Observers and military analysts alike described the futility of attempting to mount any effective resistance against these high-velocity projectiles, which were frequently launched from distances exceeding 2,000 meters. Such a range placed them far beyond the reach of Japan's standard anti-aircraft artillery, notably the 25-millimeter guns that were the primary close-range air defense weapons. By the time the larger and more powerful 127-millimeter anti-aircraft guns could be maneuvered into position, aimed, and trained on incoming rockets, the attack would often be over. The rockets, traveling at tremendous speeds and being relatively small in size, made them extraordinarily difficult to detect, track, and target successfully. The rapid inbound trajectory of these rockets diminished the chance of interception, rendering traditional anti-aircraft guns largely ineffective. The psychological impact on Japanese gun crews was profound. The sight of enormous rockets streaking through the sky, trailing fiery streams of bright flames, often induced panic and led to breaches of discipline, with many crew members abandoning their positions despite explicit orders to remain at their posts. The terror inspired by these weapon systems was not merely a matter of fear, but also a significant factor in breaking down morale and cohesion among Japanese defenders. The influence of these rocket attacks extended well beyond the immediate battlefield, striking a deep psychological and symbolic blow to Japanese morale. The Tiny Tim missile, in particular, symbolized the technological and industrial shortcomings of Japan at this stage of the war. It embodied the kind of advanced weaponry that Japan could no longer produce in meaningful quantities, representing everything that Japan's wartime industrial efforts could no longer achieve. Mass production, cutting-edge technological innovation, and the ability to project overwhelming firepower without incurring significant costs in human lives or aircraft. In stark contrast, the United States had developed a new generation of weapons that not only inflicted greater destruction, but also preserved their trained pilots in costly aircraft, an approach that exemplified sustainable warfare. While Japan was left to rely on desperate and sacrificial tactics, such as kamikaze attacks, which traded lives for limited tactical gains, the Americans steadily advanced their arsenal, producing weapons of unprecedented destructive power that could be employed without the same loss of personnel or aircraft. This shift marked a fundamental change in the nature of aerial warfare, making Japan's traditional strategies increasingly obsolete. Consequently, many Japanese military officers, privately reflecting on their deteriorating situation, reached the sobering conclusion that victory was no longer attainable. This sense of resignation permeated the higher echelons of the Japanese command, with some officers acknowledging the reality of total defeat. A prominent voice among these was Commander Toshuki Yokoi, a staff officer serving with the 5th Air Fleet, who later recounted in his post-war memoir that the appearance of Tiny Tim rockets in early 1945 was a pivotal moment. It convinced him that Japan was not merely suffering from numerical inferiority in terms of aircraft and troops. Rather, there was a profound qualitative gap, a disparity in technological capability and effectiveness that could never be bridged. While Japanese engineers struggled desperately to keep existing aircraft operational amidst dwindling supplies of materials and fuel, the Americans were deploying weapons that seemed to belong to a different technological era entirely. These monstrous rockets transformed traditional fighters into flying artillery platforms, turning the sky into a deadly battlefield where every aircraft was at risk of annihilation. Guided bombs, capable of striking with pinpoint accuracy, and proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells that made attacking American positions a virtual impossibility suicide mission, further demonstrated the technological superiority of the Allies. When the production figures for the Tiny Tim rockets, their size, complexity, and manufacturing methods, were revealed in the aftermath of the war, they caused shock among Japanese military officials. It was learned that the Americans had managed to produce thousands of these rockets despite their elaborate design, employing innovative industrial techniques that Japan could not have replicated, even at the height of its industrial power. The mass production methods used ensured consistent quality across each unit and achieved staggering output rates that would have required Japan's entire munitions industry to match. Adding to the bleak outlook was the fact that these rockets were merely one element among dozens of new and increasingly sophisticated weapon systems that came into American service in 1945. The deployment of such advanced technology underscored the hopelessness of Japan's position. highlighting the widening technological gap that had become too vast to bridge in the time remaining. During post-war interrogations, Vice Admiral Tao Kurita, who had commanded the center force during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, observed that weapons like the Tiny Tim confirmed his earlier decision to withdraw from battle. His reasoning was clear. If the United States could develop and employ such devastating tactical weapons, while also maintaining superior numbers and training, then conventional naval and air engagements no longer presented a fair. In any conceivable naval engagement during that turbulent period, the outcome would have been catastrophic for the Japanese side, not merely resulting in defeat but leading to complete annihilation. The stark reality was that the sheer technological disparity between the Allied forces and Japan had grown so vast that traditional notions of combat were rendered almost obsolete, replaced by the relentless and merciless application of advanced weaponry. It was with a tinge of bitter irony that one noted how the infamous kamikaze program, which the Japanese had initially embraced as a desperate measure, appeared almost rational in the face of such overwhelming technological superiority wielded by the Allies. The Japanese military's sense of strategic invincibility had been fundamentally eroded by the relentless march of innovation, culminating in weapons that rendered their defenses almost irrelevant. On August the 9th in the year of 1945, a pivotal attack was carried out on the Sasebo Naval Base, coinciding precisely with the devastating atomic bombing of Nagasaki. During this assault, some of the final instances of the so-called Tiny Tim rockets being employed in combat during the entire Second World War took place. These rockets were launched by Marine Corsairs flying from Task Force 38, which ruthlessly targeted the remaining operational vessels belonging to the Japanese fleet. From his concealed observation post, Commander Takashi Yamamoto witnessed the destruction unfold, describing the strikes as coldly mechanical and devoid of mercy. The rockets obliterated a submarine depot, a vital installation, and inflicted severe damage upon 2 escort vessels, all with clinical precision that seemed almost surgical in its execution. The attacking aircraft maintained such a safe distance from the base's extensive anti-aircraft defenses that they never came within range of retaliation, transforming what might have been a costly and risky attack into a one-sided execution. This unopposed assault was a clear demonstration of the technological disparity and air superiority possessed by the Allies. The psychological element of the Tiny Tim missiles deployment was not lost on American strategists who deliberately ensured that Japanese forces understood the full destructive potential of these weapons. Through the distribution of leaflets and radio broadcasts, the Americans detailed how these aerial battleship shells could level any target, destroy hardened bunkers, sink the most formidable ships, and obliterate vital military infrastructure. This dissemination of information had a profound psychological impact, contributing significantly to the collapse of morale among Japanese military personnel during those final months of the war. Many officers privately admitted that their resistance had become not only futile, but almost meaningless when faced with such overwhelming technological firepower. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, the daring aviator who had led Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor and who survived the entire conflict, later reflected in his memoirs that the Tiny Tim rocket embodied the zenith of American industrial warfare. He described it as a weapon that, while seemingly crude in its concept, essentially a humongous rocket, was also a marvel of sophistication, requiring substantial advancements in chemistry, metallurgy, and aeronautics to become operationally practical. Fuchida further observed that although Japan had begun the war with a technological edge in aircraft and tactical doctrine, by the year of 1945, the United States had completely reversed that advantage. In essence, Japanese forces had become like samurai wielding swords against an opponent equipped with machine guns, an anachronism that underscored their dwindling prospects. The Imperial Japanese Navy's final evaluation of the Tiny Tim, compiled for the post-war United States Strategic Bombing Survey, acknowledged the profound impact of the weapon beyond its actual employment figures. It had succeeded in destroying strategic installations, sinking vital ships, and, perhaps most crucially, demonstrating to the Japanese military the futility of their continued resistance against an adversary capable of deploying such devastating weaponry while conducting operations across the vast expanse of the Pacific theater. Several Japanese officers reflected that the appearance and demonstration of weapons like the Tiny Tim in early 1945 had convinced them that Japan's defeat was no longer a matter of if, but when, sealing the inevitability of their downfall. The narrative of the Tiny Tim's role in shaping Japanese perceptions and morale reveals a deeper truth about the Pacific War, namely that technological innovation and strategic efficacy could decisively tip the scales, rendering traditional resistance both futile and pointless. This story underscores how advancements in military technology, when paired with psychological warfare, could accelerate the collapse of even the most determined defenses, ultimately bringing about the conclusion of one of history's most expansive and brutal conflicts. During the final stages of the conflict, it became increasingly clear that beyond the use of atomic bombs and the massive, devastating B-29 bombing raids, it was the advent of advanced missile technology, like these rockets, that vividly illustrated the widening technological gap between the opposing sides. For every Japanese soldier and sailor, the implications of these new weapons were unmistakably clear. Aircraft carrying rockets far larger than anything Japan had in its arsenal could strike with devastating precision, destroying in mere seconds formidable fortifications which had taken months, even years, to construct and reinforce. This tangible display of American technological superiority, demonstrated repeatedly across various engagements, worked more effectively at sapping Japanese morale than any form of propaganda ever could. Post-war testimonies, such as that of Rear Admiral Somu Toyota, the last chief of Japan's Naval General Staff, underscored this point. He remarked that weapons like the Tiny Tim rocket, along with similar projectiles, had rendered Japan's defensive strategies increasingly obsolete. Before the war, Japan's military planning had been predicated on the belief that American forces would need to close in within range of Japanese defenses, be it through traditional bombings, naval gunfire, or ground assaults, to deliver meaningful strikes. However, the advent of long-range rockets like the Tiny Tim altered this fundamental assumption. These weapons granted the Americans the ability to operate at safe distances, attacking Japanese installations and capabilities in a systematic fashion, often with minimal risk to their own forces. The final battles, in essence, transitioned from conventional combat to what the Admiral described as a form of execution, where the enemy was systematically eliminated without direct confrontation. The detailed technical specifications of the Tiny Tim, once thoroughly analyzed and understood by Japanese engineers after the war, illuminated just how far American scientific and military advances had progressed in missile technology. The rocket's 24-nozzle motor, designed for stable thrust regardless of the weapon's size, represented an engineering feat that Japan had not yet achieved. This design allowed for more precise and reliable flight paths, enabling effective targeting. Additionally, the mechanical time fuse, which could be set to detonate at predetermined depths after penetration into fortified structures, demonstrated a level of sophistication in ammunition design that Japan's wartime industry simply could not match. These weapons were not only complex but also consistently reliable enough to be used routinely in combat, a testament to the high standards of quality control and manufacturing practiced by the United States, standards that Japan had never attained even during peacetime. During post-war interrogations, Lieutenant General Torishiro Kawabe, who served as Deputy Chief of Japan's Army General Staff, openly admitted that Japan's military had severely underestimated the impact that American tactical weapons development would have on the battlefield. Japan's focus remained largely on strategic bombing campaigns and conventional ground forces. Yet weapons such as the Tiny Tim rocket had made many of Japan's defensive preparations largely irrelevant. In particular, the extensive fortifications and defensive structures built throughout the Japanese home islands, designed specifically to withstand conventional bombing and ground assaults, were rendered vulnerable by these precision-guided, rocket-delivered heavy warheads. These weapons essentially negated years of meticulous preparations, vast quantities of concrete and steel, and countless hours of labor invested in fortification efforts. The financial aspect of this technological leap was staggering. When Japanese officers learned after the war how much the United States had spent developing and deploying these rockets, the figures seemed almost unbelievable. The American expenditure on the Tiny Tim program exceeded the entire naval aviation budget of Japan for the year 1945. Yet this amount constituted only a tiny fraction of the total American military budget at the time, a stark reminder of America's immense industrial capacity and its ability to pursue multiple advanced weapon systems simultaneously. This enormous and diverse industrial effort underscored a fundamental reality. In challenging a superpower with such vast industrial and technological resources, Japan had found itself confronting an opponent capable of mobilizing a broad and relentless pursuit of innovation across numerous fields of military technology. During the final stages of the Pacific War, the United States simultaneously advanced multiple missile and weapons development programs while sustaining a formidable conventional military force that had already surpassed Japanese defenses by a vast margin, both in numbers and firepower. Commander Yoshimaru Nakajima, who had played a crucial role in orchestrating the defensive strategies for Kyushu in anticipation of an anticipated American invasion, observed with a sense of both concern and revelation that the introduction of the Tiny Tim missile had fundamentally altered their understanding of American assault tactics. Their previous assumptions had centered on the idea that coastal fortifications would compel American naval fleets to keep a significant distance away from the shoreline, thereby limiting the destructive potential of pre-invasion bombardments. However, the advent of fighters capable of delivering 12-inch caliber warheads with pinpoint accuracy from escort carriers operating far offshore dramatically changed this dynamic. The precision-guided nature of these weapons meant that every cave entrance, artillery emplacement, command post, and critical infrastructure along the coast could be systematically targeted and destroyed long before the first landing craft reached the beaches, rendering the Japanese defenses significantly less effective. The contrast between Japanese and American military philosophies became more stark than ever when examining weapons like the Tiny Tim missile. While Japan endeavored to compensate for its material shortages through spiritual resolve and an unwavering willingness to sacrifice human lives, epitomized by the kamikaze program, the Americans relied on industrial efficiency and technological innovation to develop weapons that achieved superior battlefield results while aiming to minimize human casualties. This fundamental divergence in national approach to warfare and technological advancement was vividly exemplified by the Tiny Tim missile, which streaked across the Pacific skies as a symbol of American ingenuity. The Japanese viewed their struggle as one rooted in moral resolve and human spirit, whereas the Americans focused on applying the full power of their industrial capacity and technological progress to achieve victory. This ideological and tactical divergence was not merely theoretical. It translated into tangible differences in weapon design, deployment, and psychological impact. The post-war analysis conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey revealed that the Tiny Tim missile had inflicted catastrophic damage, destroying or severely damaging more than 40 Japanese vessels, ranging from destroyers and merchant ships to numerous shore installations. Yet these figures only scratch the surface of the missile's true impact. The psychological effect on Japanese forces proved to be even more profound, as the demonstration of American technological superiority eroded confidence in their defenses and shattered morale. The visible demonstration that their fortified positions could be targeted and destroyed with precision from offshore challenged the very notion of a defensible coastline. The psychological and strategic consequences of the Tiny Tim's deployment contributed significantly to the weakening and eventual collapse of organized resistance, paving the way for Japan's unconditional surrender. Ironically, the weapon's name, the Tiny Tim, suggested something small and insignificant, a nomenclature that was not accidental, but rather reflective of American confidence and a touch of bravado. It signaled their belief that even weapons with modest names could deliver devastating blows. The post-war commentators noted that this casual attitude towards such revolutionary military technology was emblematic of American optimism and self-assurance, and several Japanese officers admitted that the Americans' relaxed attitude about these powerful weapons was deeply demoralizing. They recognized that the Americans' technological superiority was so overwhelming that they could afford to be flippant about weapons that would have been considered wonder weapons by any other nation. Captain Tekai Kanashi, one of the few surviving destroyer commanders from the Japanese fleet, reflected on the profound strategic implications of the Tiny Tim missile. He remarked that the emergence of such advanced weaponry had rendered his entire tactical doctrine obsolete. Traditionally, destroyer warfare depended on speed, maneuverability, and firepower to defend against air attacks, traits that had defined their naval strategy for decades. But with the advent of precise missile technology capable of striking from offshore, the fundamental principles of destroyer tactics no longer held. The Tiny Tim symbolized a shift toward a new era of warfare, one in which technological innovation, rather than traditional maneuvering and gunfire, dictated the outcome of naval confrontations and amphibious assaults. The implications of this shift underscored the profound impact that technological advances can have on military doctrine, strategy, and, ultimately, the course of history itself. The advent of the Tiny Tim rocket marked a significant turning point in the evolution of naval warfare, fundamentally altering the strategic landscape. Unlike traditional artillery or ship-mounted guns with limited range and devastating power confined to close proximity, this missile could be launched from positions well beyond the reach of enemy gunfire, yet deliver a devastating payload comparable to that of cruiser shells. This capability meant that destroyers, once considered agile and versatile combat vessels, found themselves increasingly vulnerable, virtually defenseless, against a determined and well-coordinated air attack that could deploy such weapons from afar. The inherent disadvantage for these smaller vessels was glaring. They lacked the means to counteract or intercept these high-velocity, high-yield missiles once launched, especially as the rockets could strike with precision from distances that rendered their own defensive measures ineffective. It's worth noting that the progression of American military technology in this domain was swift and impressive. Within a matter of months, U.S. forces had resolved a long-standing problem that had challenged naval tacticians for many decades: how to accurately deliver heavy ordnance via aircraft without exposing them to lethal defensive fire. American engineers and strategists had demonstrated remarkable ingenuity, developing solutions that vastly improved the accuracy and reliability of aerial assaults with heavy weaponry. This leap in capability was not merely incremental. It fundamentally transformed the way naval and aerial engagements could be conducted, giving the United States a decisive technological edge in the final stages of the war. The last known military evaluation of the Japanese perspective on the Tiny Tim rocket was documented in August of 1945. Just days before Japan's surrender. Admiral Somu Toyota, a high-ranking officer within the Japanese Navy, remarked in a staff meeting that weapons like these rockets rendered continued resistance not just futile, but essentially suicidal. His assessment underscored a stark reality. Japan faced an arsenal of standoff weapons capable of systematically dismantling defensive positions without risking valuable ships or personnel. These weapons had become a symbol of Japanese helplessness in the face of American technological dominance. Toyota reportedly expressed that the introduction of such weapons in early 1945 convinced him that Japan's only possible choices were surrender or total annihilation. There was no room for negotiated peace when faced with an enemy that could strike from a distance with such destructive force. The psychological and cultural impact of the Tiny Tim on Japanese military consciousness persisted long after the war's end. Veterans and survivors alike remembered the distinctive, terrifying sound of these rockets, a loud screaming roar that heralded impending destruction. The sight of American aircraft carriers, particularly Corsairs and Hellcats, carrying these massive rockets became an enduring symbol of American material superiority and technological innovation. These images and memories often appeared in personal memoirs and historical accounts as pivotal moments when Japanese officers internally recognized the full extent of their defeat. It was not always through grand strategic battles or decisive land campaigns that Japan's losses became undeniable. Instead, it was through the cumulative impact of tactical encounters where American technological advantage rendered Japanese bravery virtually meaningless. In the broader scope of military history, the Tiny Tim rocket became emblematic of the profound period of technological transformation that Japan had failed to fully anticipate or counter. Its arrival in the final months of the conflict embodied the core reasons behind Japan's ultimate defeat, not merely in terms of military casualties, but in the complete and comprehensive superiority of American weaponry and industrial capacity. It showcased the United States' ability to rapidly innovate, develop, and deploy revolutionary weapons on a scale sufficient to influence the entire conduct of warfare. Beyond just technological prowess, the U.S. demonstrated exceptional organizational efficiency, producing these weapons in meaningful quantities, training personnel to operate them effectively, and integrating them into strategic operations seamlessly. Perhaps most critically, American success in this domain underscored an essential aspect of modern conflict: the necessity of intellectual flexibility, innovation, and adaptation. The capacity to solve complex technical problems through unconventional approaches that often seemed impossible or impractical to those bound by traditional thinking, became a decisive factor in the war's outcome. This single weapon, the Tiny Tim rocket, arrived during the final months and encapsulated why Japan's defeat was so comprehensive and unavoidable. It served as a stark illustration that American dominance extended beyond mere manpower or numbers. It encompassed every facet of modern warfare, including technological superiority, tactical innovation, and logistical efficiency. The arrival of this formidable missile exemplified a broader truth. In the modern battlefield, technological innovations can undermine long-held military virtues such as courage, discipline, and sacrifice, rendering them less effective or even irrelevant against the relentless precision and destructive power of advanced weaponry. No matter how resolute or determined Japanese forces might have been, their efforts were ultimately insufficient to counteract the simple physics behind a missile weighing over 12,200 pounds, equivalent to more than 5.5 tons, traveling at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour, armed with enough explosive force to obliterate reinforced bunkers or cause critical structural damage to warships, such as breaking a destroyer's keel. These rockets could be launched from well beyond the range of traditional defensive systems. In the aftermath of the Second World War, Japan grappled with the profound and often tragic dilemmas that arose from attempting to address its security concerns through policies and actions driven by unsustainable human sacrifice. During those challenging years, as the scars of conflict slowly healed, a significant transformation was taking place not only in the political landscape, but also within the military doctrines of the nation. Interestingly, even long after the war concluded and former adversaries had transitioned into allies, fascinating interactions persisted between Japanese military officers and their American counterparts. Many Japanese officers who were enrolled in American military academies or training programs would frequently request demonstrations of the Tiny Tim rocket, a weapon that had played a pivotal role during the war. These requests were not driven by nostalgia or a desire to relive past glories. Instead, they stemmed from a deep professional curiosity and a need to understand the technological marvels that had radically altered the face of warfare. The Tiny Tim, with its impressive reach and destructive power, embodied the degree to which military technology was advancing. For these Japanese officers, studying such weapons was crucial for grasping the new realities of aerial combat and strategic deterrence. American instructors observing these interactions would often note a complex mixture of emotions reflected in their Japanese colleagues. There was, on one hand, a palpable sense of admiration for the remarkable engineering achievements represented by the weapon. They recognized the ingenuity and technological prowess that had gone into developing such a missile, which had left a lasting impression on the evolution of modern warfare. On the other hand, there was also a deep sense of regret that their former enemies had failed to fully realize during the period of conflict how fundamentally the rules and nature of warfare had been shifting toward new paradigms. This regret was intertwined with the understanding that fighting the War of 1945 using the same mindset and strategies of the previous war, 1941, was a grave mistake. Japan, like many other nations, had been caught unprepared for the rapid developments in military technology that ushered in an era of air power, missile technology, and precision strikes. The tragic lesson, painfully learned in the aftermath of the war, was that clinging to outdated doctrines and underestimating the pace of technological change could have disastrous consequences, forcing a nation into a cycle of destructive sacrifices that proved ultimately unsustainable. In essence, the post-war period became a time of reflection and reassessment, where even former enemies recognized the importance of adapting to the new realities of warfare shaped by innovation and technological progress. The interactions between Japanese officers and their American instructors underscored not only the shared understanding of these profound shifts, but also the lingering regrets over missed opportunities to anticipate and prepare for the future of combat.